everyone. My name is Andy Johnson. I am with the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative, ADL initiative, as a SETA contractor. ADL is a research and development branch of the Department of Defense. Our job is to bring policy and prototypes into DoD to explore the distributed learning space and to advance the state of specifications and standards, which is my role there as the specifications and standards manager. I'm joined by Art Werkenthin.
Hi, I'm Art Werkentin with Risk Incorporated. We're an LMS LRS provider based in Houston, Texas. I've been doing that since 1992. I've been on the cmi5 working group for 8 long years, working in the cmi5 space. I've also written the ADL script library for cmi5 that's publicly available.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Hernandez, and recently I joined Design Interactive in the Performance Augmentation Division. Prior to this, I spent 10 years working as a government employee at NOC TSD, and amongst other commands in the Department of the Navy. And the last few years, I was actually a SETA contractor at the ADL initiative, working with Andy on the total learning architecture. And I'm happy to be a part of helping you learn about cmi5 today.
All right, and great, and thanks to you both, and thank you all for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started with understanding and applying cmi5 and an XAPI solution. One quick qualification I had, I've been the XAPI project lead at ADL for pretty much its entire duration. So that is where we're going to start. We're going to get into, first of all, what the learning outcomes for this presentation are. So by the time you're done, hopefully you will have gained a baseline understanding of Experience API. You'll understand the subject matter of the cmi5, which oddly is not an acronym. So at one point in the cmi5 evolution, CMI stood for Computer Managed Instruction, and that was true for version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4. However, once we got into the 5th iteration of this specification, we realized that Computer Managed Instruction has kind of become a misnomer because things have just evolved too far beyond it. So we decided we're going to get rid of that acronym, and instead we're just going to call it CMI5, so it's cooler, I guess. So it's not actually an acronym, but so that's why it's going to be lowercase throughout the presentation, just so you know we're not making a mistake there. You will understand how to apply and use XAPI profiles. You will understand how to apply cmi5 as a replacement to SCORM to traditional e-learning course. Now, if you don't know what SCORM is, don't worry, because we're moving past it. It's considered in the past. And finally, you will be able to understand the products and services that integrate cmi5 so that you can make informed acquisition decisions. Now, the topics and overviews are pretty much the same. These are the 5 things we're going to get into, just a little more concise. Experience API basics, a deep dive into cmi5, the XAPI profiles, available products and tools, and crafting cmi5 solutions. So first, the first expected learning outcome, you'll gain an understanding of XAPI, such that the additional requirements of cmi5 will be comprehensible. This includes the role and structure of XAPI statements, the learning record store, and additional XAPI resources / endpoints that are used in a holistic approach to distributed learning. So we have to ask ourselves, why XAPI? Well, there's 3 basics that you can see here. First, that learning can be recorded wherever it occurs. If I could tell you in Department of Defense how valuable it would be to record data that would normally just be recorded on a clipboard, a guy standing someplace checking off if you're doing something correctly or not, you would be surprised how much value that adds. There's still a lot of paper that flies around in DoD. This, of course, feeds into learning analytics. If you have data, you can start to put them into dashboards and do interesting things with it and not be necessarily restricted to basic data, scores, and be able to have customized report. Basically, you're limited in innovation by the software that you're buying, but you're a specialist in the field, not theirs. So you need to be able to bring your own specialization to light. Finally, learning doesn't have to be launched from an LMS. There's mobile apps, there's social networking, there's serious games and simulations. There's all kinds of different modalities and social practices that we can now capture that aren't necessarily part of an LMS brand that we'd say. Most of these other types of niche solutions aren't really built with analytics in mind. At best, you're going to see something about the learner and not necessarily about the material because there's not really a lot of interest in a product self-proving. You want to, because they built it. but you actually want to test them. You want to put their feet to the fire on that. So getting into what XAPI is, we're going to give two definitions, a basic and a technical. The basic, I just ask that you remember this one for the presentation, and basically XAPI statements are data generated by a learning record provider, LRP, and sent to a learning record store, LRS. So it's provided and it's stored. As you can imagine, it's also then retrieved. Now, here's a technical definition. If you're techie, this might make a lot of sense. If you're not, don't worry, you can look once and forget it if you need to. Experience API, which is an IEEE standard, 2B, is the JavaScript object notation, also known as JSON data model, format, and representational state transfer RESTful web service application programming interface, API, for communication and activities experienced by an individual, group, or other entity, and a learning record store. So let's unpack that a little bit. IEEE means it's going to be a standard. JSON is like JavaScript, so that's basically what makes web pages go, but improved. REST is a basic model that the internet largely agrees is how things are saved, updated, and loaded. Web services have to do with the idea of a distributed model, and we'll get to more of that later. And then the API notion are parts that are integral to web services. And basically, that allows web applications to talk to each other without surrendering security or access to it. And then the idea is that between all these applications and groups, they interact with this learning record store that can do something with the data. So a few terms I want to get into, and I've already used the term LMS before. When we say LMS, we're talking about an entire suite of web services, all these little programs together, used in a traditional distributed learning solution like SCORM. Again, if you don't know what SCORM is, that's okay, because you probably know what an LMS is because you probably use one for your distributed learning. The learning record provider, simply the sender in XAPI. The learning record store, simply the receiver in XAPI. A statement is a single artifact of activity in XAPI. We akin this to I did this, actor, verb, object. Documents are also an XAPI data structure. These are large sets of data that have name-value pairs that are usually used to keep state in XAPI. The resource endpoint are ways to interface with XAPI to the basic programming methods, so basically the means by which to send and receive data. And any learning asset deployed in a distributed learning environment. So again, if you know SCORM, great. If not, all you need to really know that it was a web standard, and for that reason it has value. But there are a lot of things that have become different, that become issues over the years that we've figured out a better way to do things. So I want to break down what the XAPI components are. So on the left you'll see an LRP, and inside of it is content. And that content and LRP together forms kind of a duo that can interact by sending statements, creating them, and modifying documents that already exist that are kind of the key functions for data in XAPI. They then store these in an LRS, and they do that by sending them or receiving them through resources and endpoints. Now, a couple things about this specifically. The LRP could be an LMS that registers the content, because content likely needs authorization to use, and that part can be done through the LRP or not. For the most part, your content is going to be the LRP with the LMS involved, but both the buyer and the model will vary in there. Now, the LRP creates, modifies statements and documents. Statements don't just necessarily come from the content. The content can likely handcraft a statement and provide that to the LRP to then send to the LRS, but the LRP is what actually does that communication. Now, the endpoints and resources, it depends on what school of technical thought you're from, is which one you call it. These are web addresses where things are sent to and retrieved from. Statements have a specific one, and then each document type also have different ones. And we'll get into what those document types are a little bit later. Now, the LRS does allow retrieval, but notice that the content is not reliant on it specifically. While messages can get back to the LRP, do go back to the LRP, letting you know that the statements were sent successfully or the content or the data was updated successfully, there's not an expectation that content communicates back and forth. So, in other words, documents and states can read if necessary, but they don't have to. Now, I want to get into the parts of the statement. We touched on this a little bit earlier with the I did this, but the actor is the doer of the statement. and that can be expressed as a name. There are many controls for making this unique because you do want to essentially have that attributed to you in the data, but there's also a necessary component to obscuring it because you might not want your name out there for other people to take. Verbs are the action in the statement, and they really are what make XAPI statements go round. These are the most common way of defining expected behavior of a statement. XAPI also does something smart, and they separate the verb identifier, which keeps them unique, from the display, which is the part that is actually shown to users shown to users when you are displaying visualizations. So there's not like a mad rush for everyone to get completed or fired or other words that might mean a specific thing when you actually mean something else. Also, it won't be a monopoly if some other organization takes the word, and if you want to do something slightly different but still use the same words, you don't have to find a synonym to do it. Object. So this is, if you're thinking of the English language, it'd be like a direct object of the statement. And oftentimes in distributed learning, this is some sort of actual web activity, usually some sort of page, course, something, some level of granularity. It could also be a real or virtual object that has an identifier. So if you're in a virtual world, you could be talking about a virtual thing. And if you're in the real world, you can send virtual data about a real thing. Object can also be another actor. Now, results in context. So I could say yes. If you think about the I did this, you could say, sure, Andy completed examination, but don't you want to see the score that I received? Do you want to see where I was, if I was virtual or in the classroom? Do you want to see who the instructor might have been? These are the kinds of data that we need, and those are captured in results in context. And finally, it's a timestamp. And timestamps are when the experience actually happened. Now, timestamps provide a valuable paper trail, and Art's going to talk a little bit more of the value of that paper trail, but it's a great improvement over the state-based model that SCORM is. And these timestamps are expressed globally to avoid confusion. So the basics of the reason for having all this is to allow the basic construction of human-machine readable expressions. And we'll get into that in just a minute. I want to show a few sample statements first. As you can see here, on the left is the actor. They're all Andy in this case. And the middle is the verb, and on the right is the object. So Andy launched chemistry quiz, he initialized it, answered a question in it, ended up passing it, completed it, terminated, and then satisfied both the quiz and the unit. And we'll get into what these specific verbs mean later, but you can kind of see the basic structure of a human readable statement. Now, one thing that XAPI does really well is it makes communication much easier between programmers and designers. One doesn't need to understand all the particular fields of XAPI to design using it. We see here a designer on the left expressing requirements of the software applications to the engineer on the right. The common language is similar to that of the code, which is also machine readable. So both humans and machines can talk to each other easily. So both conversations will flow and machines can talk to each other. We'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about semantic web. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of an XAPI fridge. So to put a bow on how this language and XAPI all works together, we want to enable a smart fridge. Now, if you can imagine some of the things that a smart fridge might do, you would have some maintenance procedures. So let's say it keeps track of the different things you have to do when you have to defrost it, and it will let you know when those procedures are necessary, or if there's some sort of emergency with it, it could let you know. Clearly stocking the fridge, right? Knowing what's in the fridge at any given time, when something might be running out, and how long it's been in there. So if it's been in there a long time, maybe something's spoiled. Consumption. We might want to see who's eating food, how often is it going out, because we might want to have, update our shopping list based on what's being consumed. And maybe even security. Maybe you don't want your kids eating a lot of candy, or maybe you have beer in the fridge and you don't want somebody underage consuming it. There are a lot of applications for this smart fridge that we can see having value that goes beyond what you might think of out of a course, right? So there's different things in play and different functions that we can see. There's also different actors in this fridge. So different people are going to interact with it, so everyone in the house might interact with it, so they would each have different actor identifiers that would do that. And the fridge itself would be an actor. So if the fridge is going to report its temperature, the fridge will be the actor of that statement, and it will end up reporting the temperature. There are different actions or verbs that would also align to these functions. So if we talk about setting the temperature, you could have a verb that just says set temperature to, or something like that. You could have, if something was taken out, you just say took, Andy took blank, apples from the fridge. We could have other verbs that have to do with putting things back in the fridge, and there are a lot of functions that you could see working with this fridge. And then finally, there's different objects that can also interact with the fridge. Now, these can be some tangible things that, like apple, cheese, bacon, or there could be intangible things like the temperature setting, etc. So there's different objects, and I'd even say another intangible one would be like a security procedure or the maintenance procedures. Now, sometimes there's more details that are going to be needed, so we need some results or context as well. So if I say something like Becky supplied apples to the fridge, well, I need to know how many there were or how much those weighed, depending on how I want to keep track of it. Similarly, for Tommy, you received bacon from the fridge, how much? I might want to add it to the shopping list if he's taking a lot of it. And then finally, fridge adds bacon. So again, we're switching up the actors here. And there's some sort of context to that, right? What do you mean adding it? But, well, the addition here is in the context of a shopping list. But if you see that there's a shopping list and there's bacon, there's two different objects there. So the bacon becomes the object and the shopping list becomes the context. Or we could design a fridge that does the opposite. So hopefully this has given you an idea of what we can do with XAPI, that it's flexible but still powerful in what it can do. Now, that kind of that defines what statements are, but now let's talk about this notion of the Learning Record Store, or LRS. The LRS is the server-side implementation of XAPI. The Learner Record Store is the notion of a triple store, which again, these actor verb objects, I did this, which is RESTful. It follows those principles, those web services that are lightweight, highly scalable, and maintainable by following a certain set of constraints, basically the different create, delete, update options that are available. So in XAPI, very little validation is actually done at runtime, which makes it fast and flexible. So XAPI essentially does not rely on the LRS to make sense of what statements are, which statements it should use and which it shouldn't. It provides a structure, but doesn't really understand statements. It's not expected to. So it won't throw out something like, Andy friended biochemistry quiz. Clearly this doesn't make sense, but the LRS isn't going to do that. It's just for validation. We are going to be reliant on other services to extract the meaning from that data and then expose it in interesting ways to the learner. So in the use of XAPI, some of the individual content, there's some content that's going to be reliant. There's some content features that are going to be enabled both by the LMS and the LRS. But I wanted to get into what the specific differences are between this LMS, Learning Management System, and LRS. So we can see individual content maybe taking on some of these responsibilities, but for the most part, if you have a system that's responsible for all the boxes here, that's an LMS. The LRS is really only responsible for the learning records. Now, you can buy a product that goes beyond that, and you'll see in LRSs that have a lot of different web services, which is really what all these different boxes are, is some sort of web service that's done. The LRS, by definition, though, is only responsible for the one in blue, the learning records. It's intended to separate this out this functionality and allow the other services to complement it by having a best-of-breeds type of situation. So if you wanted to buy a really robust learning record store, but then you also wanted to buy a different gradebook application or a different player, you could do that rather than having to bundle it all in a single product. So if I have content that could create statements, like any web page, and I have an LRS to send those statements to, then why do I need this learning record provider? So my response to that is, let's look at these questions, and if any of these are important to you, then the LRP should also be important to you. So let's imagine a world where the content sent statements wildly to a learning record store. There's no learning record provider. We'd have to ask these questions. Is my content actually sending it correctly? Does my content have permission on that system? Will I get credit? Does the instructor actually know who I am, and can they get to that LRS? Because without that registration component, we don't know those types of things. And similarly, if the LRS, on the other end, just accepted statements that were sent from content blindly and didn't have a trusted source, we don't know. Is the learner actually who they say they are? I mean, cheating would be very easy. Is the instruction on the statement actually real? Is that person actually on the other end? And, for content providers, the key thing you want to see is, do they pay for the rights to take this content? That's one thing you usually know when there's an LMS, is that that registration is happening, so you know how many seats there are. If it's just wildly sent from content, we might not know. So that's basically summed up as saying the learning record provider is that trusted partner of the learning record store, ensuring that data is both reliable and valid. So I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about linked data in its use in XAPI. So XAPI, through both the data of statements and the documents, creates semantic data relationships. Now, when we talk about semantic data, we're talking about the semantic web. Semantic web is a dictionary, really, that everybody agrees upon, but it's a dictionary for not humans, but for machines. So when machines can talk to each other, the semantic web is a way that they can come to an agreement on what is what. So a lot of times this is done through two objects and then a specific relationship they have with each other. So it forms a logical triple. Similarly, statements are also triples. They have actor, verb, object. You'll notice on each end there's also something that you'd probably consider to be an object, an actor, and the object itself. And then the verb, which is some sort of relationship they have to each other. So XAPI has a really natural integration into systems that use the semantic web. So in the fridge examples, what we could do is the fridge could decide what to buy, maybe based on cost, because a statement's not going to tell you what apples cost, but there might be something, a resource on the web that tells you price, and it might tell you that the apples cost something. So then the fridge then could understand, and then through that, the fridge could also understand things with equivalent relationships. So let's say you're making a recipe, and you're willing to substitute something for another, and using the semantic web, the fridge understands that. So as the fridge is trying to tell you if you have sufficient ingredients to create this recipe or not, it can go out to the semantic web and connect apples, cheese, bacon to those specific prices, or maybe even calories. Let's say you're trying to task your smart fridge to tell me if I have the things to make a meal that's under 800 calories. It would need to get this data from a source, and linked data is the way that you could get there. So if we now apply this context to distributed learning instead, we could have competencies, which are essentially things that a person could know, an attribute, skill, or ability, or knowledge, skill, or ability. And those could then interrelate on the semantic web, and then we would understand that when they're achieved by individuals, they would aggregate for higher achievement. So understanding how these things go together and aggregate could work in a distributed learning solution. Now, I wanted to hand over to Art Werkenthin, who is, in my opinion, the #1 cmi5 expert in the world, to talk through the details of what cmi5 is. So, Art, take it away, sir.
All right. Thanks a lot, Andy. Appreciate it. For expected learning outcome number 2, we'll be discussing the key concept of cmi5 specification. Specifically, we're going to look at the authentication, data flow, session management, and storage capabilities of cmi5, as well as the additional requirements of cmi5 LMS beyond the standard capabilities of a learning record store. At its highest and simplest level, you can think of cmi5 as the specification that defines how to use XAPI when you're launching content from an LMS. It's the use case for XAPI in the LMS launches content scenario. It was originally designed as a replacement for SCORM. With cmi5, you're getting the best of both worlds. You get the convenience of SCORM with the packaging and the importing of content, and the extended data tracking capabilities of XAPI, and you lose a lot of the negatives of SCORM. So what's wrong with SCORM? A lot, actually. In 2010, ADL conducted a research project to investigate the issues and explore solutions for SCORM. You might have heard of it. It was called Project Tin Can. First, let's look at some of the highlights of that study. Pop-up windows. I've seen SCORM content launch as many as 4 pop-up windows. Normally it's 1 or 2. 4 seems pretty extreme, but we had some content do it. Why are pop-up windows bad? Well, first, they're terrible on mobile devices. If you have something pop up on your phone and it opens in a new browser window, it's hard to find where you came from to get back. I search for it every time on my phone, and I'm fairly technical. The other issue with pop-up windows is that they create a problem for support. As an LMS provider since 1992, I can tell you that the #1 call to our help desk is a student has clicked a link to launch content and nothing happened. We now know that we're on the great hunt, the hunt for pop-up blockers. I have found as many personally as 7 on a learner's machine. Now, in order to get them removed, we have to call the customer's IT support to get them to remove them or disable them or put us on a friendly list that allows pop-up windows to open for content. That is a lot of effort, a lot of time for a lot of people. Another problem with SCORM is the content must reside in the same domain as the LMS. What does that mean practically? Well, it means that the LMS and the content are sitting on the same web server. Now, as content gets larger and larger, including use of videos, voice, narration, music, all kinds of things to make it more interesting to students, it takes up more and more bandwidth. If your student is remote from the server, some distance from the server, that content can take a long time to download, and it's frustrating for your students and it's inefficient. So what we'd like to do is run on a content distribution network. Well, we can't do that with SCORM because the spec requires that all of the content reside in the same domain as the LMS. So cmi5 will solve that problem, and we'll talk about that later. An additional issue with SCORM is that all content must be run in the browser. Now, when SCORM was developed, cell phones were the size of bricks or backpacks, and they weren't smartphones. They couldn't play e-learning content. So it wasn't really an issue. Well, it is now. Most students would prefer to receive content on mobile. They may need to receive content offline. These are very difficult cases to implement in SCORM. It's also easier to cheat. Now, I'm not going to tell you how, but an issue is that in SCORM, the LMS must blindly accept whatever is sent to it. It also doesn't have the kind of paper trail model that Andy mentioned. It is a state model. That means that you have one score, and if it gets updated, say through hacking, then you don't have the previous state. So you don't know that it was hacked. You don't have a timestamp indicating what time that score came in. So we need to fix that. And the way to do that is to move forward with the new specification. cmi5 is essentially a set of extra rules applied to XAPI in the LMS launches content scenario. It is very extensible and it inherits that extensibility from XAPI itself. So it just comes along for free by using XAPI as the base data transport and storage mechanism for cmi5. Let's look at some of the things that are included in cmi5. First, there's the packaging and import of content as well as content launching mechanism. The importing is similar but different from SCORM, and we'll talk about that later. Authorization to content is provided in cmi5, but not authentication of the user. Authentication is the role of the learning management system, or the LMS. cmi5 doesn't care how the LMS does this, whether it be through fingerprint, whether it be through voice ID, whether it be through key cards, or an easily guessable password. It just doesn't care. It's not cmi5's issue. It's the LMS's issue. Session management. In cmi5, all sessions have a bookend. They have a launched statement at the beginning, and they have a terminated statement at the end. And each one of the statements in between includes a unique session identifier, so we know which session those statements came from. This allows reporting across a single session, so we can see everything that happened in one single launch to terminate bookended session. Since cmi5 is based on XAPI, you can always retrieve your data back. This is not necessarily true of SCORM, usually isn't true. SCORM does have a big data model, but it's not extensible, and in most LMSs, it's pretty hard to find your data. Not true with cmi5, you can always directly query the LRS. It's part of the specification. There's a course structure package in cmi5. It includes a course title, description, objectives, and one or more assignable modules or assignable units. It can also include blocks, which we'll talk more about later. Each assignable unit has a satisfaction criteria. These criteria are very clearly defined in the cmi5 specification, which is another contrast to SCORM, where there's still controversy to this day over some parts of the spec about what is completion and what is not completion. Give a brief history of cmi5. Originally started in the aviation industry computer-based training committee back in 2010. AICC intended cmi5 to replace both the AICC's own specification as well as SCORM. In 2012, with XAPI taking off and getting its place in the industry, AICC decided to replace its base architecture with XAPI, seeing the benefits of the XAPI and a clearer path to the adoption of cmi5 itself if it was based upon XAPI. When the AICC formally dissolved in 2014, the CMI specification control was transferred to ADL. Specification is currently managed by the cmi5 working group sponsored by ADL, and members are a combination of industry representatives and government. So what are the use cases that cmi5 enabled? Well, the first one is a minimal LMS. It would be possible to build a system that all it does is import content, let cmi5 store it, launch it for students, handle all the LMS side of functions by sending statements and acting as the endpoint for statements coming from the assignable unit without all the bells and whistles of a giant LMS. cmi5 also allows for content-defined data. Now, as I mentioned, SCORM does have a big data model. It is not, however, extensible. It says so right in the SCORM specification. cmi5, again, because it's based on XAPI, allows extension of the data model. For example, perhaps you want to have a student video themselves performing a task and then upload that as part of a statement and have it graded by an instructor. That's completely possible with cmi5 because XAPI allows upload of attachments. Not possible with SCORM. cmi5 also enables the use case of content as a service. Specifically allows content to reside in other domains. Multiple domains can exist in a single course. Each AU could be in a different domain. It's completely possible. This enables content as a service, where you buy content from a vendor on a per usage basis, yet the content remains on the vendor's website. There's a real advantage in that. If the vendor wants to update the content, they don't have to ship it to you and you import it back into your LMS. They can just update it and it will immediately update the next time a student launches it. Not an issue with cmi5. cmi5 also provides browser, operating system, and device independence. Browser's not required. A cmi5 LMS can launch a mobile app. Of course, it's up to the features of your LMS whether it does this or not. cmi5 also enables the idea of sharing data between modules. For example, Module 1 could ask the student a series of questions, and then when Module 2 launches, it reads the results from Module 1 and adapts its behavior based on the student's answers. Can't do that with SCORM either. Let's take a look now at the roles and responsibilities in cmi5. First, we'll take a look at the role of the assignable unit. Assignable unit is a content module, similar to a SCO in SCORM. A single course can contain many assignable units. An LMS is required under the specification to be able to import as many, at least 1,000 AU in a single course. The content, once it launches, parses the launch parameters to get the endpoint. This is how it's going to communicate with the LMS/LRS. It also gets other parameters, which I'll talk about later in this presentation. It then goes about its mission of delivering content, sending and fetching statements as required, reading and writing documents to the state API. All data, of course, has to be formatted according to the defined data types and vocabularies of cmi5. When the content is complete, it sends a terminated statement and returns control back to the LMS. Now let's look at the responsibilities of the LMS. First, it creates and maintains course structures. Now, normally these are imported, but depending upon the features of your LMS, you may be able to generate one from scratch inside the LMS itself. But the LMS should have some capabilities for modifying what it imports, for example, changing the mastery score. cmi5, the LMS then acts as a server for XAPI messages coming from the AU and returning data as required. The LMS also handles the launch of the AU and the maintenance of the authorization tokens, which we'll talk about when we get to that slide on data flow. Now, this is similar to the component model that Andy showed earlier, but you'll notice that cmi5 has simplified it. We don't have a learning record provider in this case, except the AU itself. In cmi5, the AU generally will act as the learning record provider. Now, there are some reads on this side as well. The original document, Andy had arrows writing only, although they could read. There are some requirements in cmi5 that the AU read the state document, for example. But it creates statements. It can also read them back if it wants to do adaptive learning. It can also write its own state documents, for example, if it wants to store a bookmark. That's what the state API is for. Now, we mentioned that cmi5 is XAPI with rules. This is one of the rules. There are 9 cmi5 verbs. It's important to note that some of these verbs are sent by the LMS, such as launched, and should not be sent by the AU. The AU should not send a launch statement. Instead, it should send an initialized statement when it's ready to go. That is not sent by the LMS, it's sent by the AU. The AU would also send things like passed, failed, and completed, and terminated. The waived statement is reserved for the LMS or an external system. It should not be sent by the assignable unit. In this chart, we look at the data flow of a cmi5 launch session. First, the LMS writes a state document. The state document includes things that the AU needs to know in order to send valid cmi5 statements during this session. First off, it includes something called a context template. This context template has to be included in the context area of an XAPI statement for every statement that the assignable unit or the LMS send. Context template could include, or does include, the session identifier, that unique identifier that shows the bookended session, and it includes context activities such as the publisher ID. The publisher ID is a unique identifier for the assignable unit when it's created by its developer, and it is included in every statement as part of the cmi5 data flow. The next thing that the LMS does is write an agent profile. This includes the student's language or preferred language. It can be a list of preferred languages if you wish, and it includes volume information. So, for example, should the volume be on or off? It's a student preference. Then the LMS writes a launch statement. This indicates that it has completed its setup activities and is prepared to launch the assignable unit. Then it goes ahead and does that. It opens the assignable unit and control transfers to the assignable unit. All the items in blue are handled by the assignable unit. First thing that the assignable unit has to do is get the authorization token. The LMS provides something called the fetch URL on the launch line. This allows the AU to hit that URL and get an authorization token that it can use during this session to read and write from the Learning Record Store. Now that it has its authorization token, it can read that state document that I mentioned earlier that contains information that it has to use to send valid statements. Next, it reads the agent profile. Hopefully it can adapt to whatever language the student prefers, and hopefully it will set its volume based on what's in the agent profile as the student's preference. Next, it writes an initialized statement. This indicates that it has performed its setup activities and is ready to deliver the content to the student. So the pink box says training content. This is just the regular delivery of content from an assignable unit to a student. The items on the left, the passed, failed, and completed statements, can be sent by the AU. Notice that they have a 1 in the box with them. That indicates they may only be sent once. Then there are cmi5 allowed statements, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will cover during this presentation. These are statements that the AU can write as many of as it wishes. They just have to conform to the rules of the cmi5 specification, and we'll cover more about that later. When the student is done with the content and is ready to exit, the content writes a terminated statement. It then returns control to the LMS, and we're back on the LMS side of the house. So there's a satisfaction criteria that we mentioned earlier. It's called the move on criteria in cmi5. So the LMS has to determine at this point, did I see the correct statements that allow me to say that this module has been satisfied? If so, it can send a satisfied statement for the assignable unit, although presently that is not required. And then it has to perform roll-up activities. And we'll talk about that more on another slide. I've also got a box in here for an external intervention. In this case, for example, our LMS allows you to test out of content. So maybe module 1 contains a test and you score well enough to move on to module 3 or module 4. Well, the LMS can mark those lessons as waived. It has to send a waived statement. It's required by specification, and then the student can move on to the later lessons that are next in line. So that's an optional feature of an LMS. It just depends upon which features your LMS may provide. However, if you have any concept in your LMS of being able to skip lessons, a waived statement should be written for those items. So we mentioned that cmi5 is XAPI with rules. Let's talk about some more of those rules. First off, as Andy mentioned earlier, there's a variety of ways to name your actor or identify your actor in XAPI. In cmi5, we require that you use the account method of that identification. Typically, that will be the LMS account information. The verbs, we already mentioned that there are 9 verbs. You can send each verb only once during a session, and there are some additional rules. For example, you cannot send a failed statement after you have already sent a pass statement. It's not allowed under the specification. And I'll talk about how you can do attempts later in the session. The rules that we've discussed, however, apply only to cmi5 defined statements. Allowed statements can use any verb, including the 9 cmi5 verbs. We'll talk again more on allowed and define in a future slide. There's a rule about the object for the assignable unit. It can only use the activity ID provided to it by the LMS on the launch line. It doesn't get to use its own. That belongs in the context property for publisher ID, as I mentioned earlier. The LMS activity ID can be the course, however, or a block, or an assignable unit. Remember, I mentioned that it has to write satisfied statements for blocks and courses, in which case it uses the unique identifier for those items. Score. The assignable unit may provide a score on a passed or a failed statement, but not on others. It's not required, however. If the score is provided in a pass statement, it must be greater than or equal to the mastery score that was provided by the LMS in the state document. Otherwise, it's an invalid statement and should be rejected by the LMS. The success property must be set on passed, waived, and failed statements. Other statements are not allowed to set the success property. The completion property must be set on completed and waived statements, but may not be included on other statements. The registration is created by the LMS and must uniquely identify the enrollment of a learner in a course. So I mentioned that we would talk about cmi5 and cmi5 allowed statements, and here we are. cmi5, all the rules we've talked about so far apply only to cmi5 defined statements. cmi5 defined statements use a specific category ID in the context of the XAPI statements. And they use one of the cmi5 defined verbs. You can think of cmi5 defined statements as something the LMS will use to determine the status of the AU. Is it satisfied or not satisfied, for example? cmi5 allowed statements, on the other hand, can use any verb, including one of the 9 cmi5 verbs. An example might be a CMI interaction. So if you give a test during your content, you would want to write the results of each question using a CMI interaction type of statement. You can also use this for attempts, as I mentioned. For example, you can write failed, 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 then passed if you allow that many attempts in your session. And it can all be CMI5 allowed statements, and that's perfectly fine. Then at the end, you would write a CMI5 pass statement because they finally passed finally passed the test, and you would write that as a CMI5 defined statement and then exit the content. All statements, as I mentioned earlier, must include that context template provided in the XAPI state store. Some additional CMI5 features include an authorized launch mechanism. The launch line can include AU-specific parameters. These are provided to the LMS by the course developer in the import package for each AU. They're not required, but if they are present, the LMS will return them to the AU when it launches it on the launch line. The launch line will also include the actor, the LMS-generated object ID, the LMS-created registration, and the fetch URL, which I mentioned earlier, is used to get the authorization token for that particular session. Now, the course structure is similar to a SCORM package, but pretty different too. It may not include any actual content, or it might not include any actual content. It can, but it doesn't have to. In that case, if there's no content, it will include fully qualified URLs to get to the content itself, which can be in other domains. It may also include blocks, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. The course structure is designed to be interoperable across systems. I mentioned earlier that we can have blocks of assignable units in the course structure. This is a fairly complex structure where we've got blocks, and some of them have nested blocks in them, and there's actually no limit to the number of nested blocks that you can have in the CMI5 course structure. So this implies a roll-up is required by the LMS because it has to write satisfied statements. So if a student completes an assignable unit, it might complete a block, in which case the LMS is required to send a satisfied statement. That in turn may complete another block, which may require another satisfied statement be sent as part of the roll-up. Or it can complete the entire course, in which case a satisfied statement is required for the entire course. So it's the job of the LMS to handle this roll-up. Let's talk about some additional things that show the versatility of CMI5. We mentioned the bookended session tracking, and that's true for the LMS, but the AU can also store any data it wants to the XAPI state to track its own sessions. For example, bookmarking, or items viewed, or pages viewed, or items not viewed. So that if a student launches an AU for a second time, it can restore its exact state and the student can pick up where they left off. We talked earlier about move on or completion criteria. There are a variety of ways to do this in CMI5. One, you can say that the past statement must be sent. Past means that some sort of judged activity, for example, a test, was passed by the student. And if the criteria for move on is passed, that past statement is what allows the student to move on. The completed statement is another way that you can indicate that the AU has been satisfied. That means that all relevant material has been experienced by the student, relevant being in the eye of a content developer. Completed and passed, that means that both the completed and passed statements must be received in order for the AU to consider the AU satisfied. There's also a completed or passed, in which either one of those statements indicates that the content has been satisfied. The mastery score. This is very different from the score in SCORM in that the LMS administrator may change the score. An example use of this is when different roles require different mastery scores. Maybe some people require passing with 100, others, because of their role, only require 70. And we already mentioned the concept of waived, an external intervention where you can test out, or you could have a situation where an instructor waives a lesson. In that case, a waived statement needs to be sent. Depends on the features of your LMS. Your mileage may vary. Do a quick revisit of the cmi5 data flow, focusing on the training content box. I mentioned the cmi5 allowed statement. We explained what that means. Again, you can only write one of each of the cmi5 defined verbs, but you can write as many cmi5 allowed statements as you wish, provided you follow the rules for those statements. And now I'll hand it off to Mike Hernandez.
Thanks, Art. So Art set up this section perfectly when he revisited the cmi5 training box. In Expected Learning Outcome 3, learners will understand the application and use of XAPI profiles. This includes the use of multiple profiles in a single solution, as well as best practices in creation and reuse of vocabulary found within XAPI profiles. Learners will be able to understand the difference between cmi5 defined and cmi5 allowed statements. cmi5 provides a sound foundation for tracking a myriad of experiences via XAPI and LMS, including from a bunch of different learning record providers. Profiles create an opportunity for the richness and complexity of experiences to be captured and have their meaning preserved within XAPI consistently over time. Often we hear that profiles are recipes, and I like that analogy. Not just that they tell you the ingredients, which are the verbs, but that profiles can provide a way to share a mindset or approach to observing an experience. Recipes are tied to specific techniques around how to prepare a dish a certain way. That ability to transfer complex concepts within a community is also present in some XAPI profiles. They can include things like weighting of experiences, a learning strategy, or even details on how a system used in the training environment was functioning at the time of the statement's generation. There can be a lot more to a profile than just a list of verbs. We will also dive into how you nest profiles within a cmi5 training content block. This creates an opportunity to have complex data within a well-defined structure. And finally, defined versus allowed will be revisited. This is part of a larger key learning point that good profiles only come from good verbs. All right. So profiles often come from a community of practice. There are a lot of these out there today: medical, specific media like video and audio, instructional design, and many other domains. We also see groups starting to create profiles for other complex experiences and for work-related environments. Profiles are a way to share a data strategy, but don't require disclosing how a specific technology works. The cmi5 effort is unique where it goes beyond a regular profile and really explains how to reach a capability that includes XAPI. Many of the other profiles point out data structures for a general use case. There's a good amount of discussion in the community on how to track versions of profiles. Now, the equation of a profile on the right side of the slide is important to consider when looking at a learning experience. The use case could include a range of things, like performing a procedure or a lab within a course. There's also the possibility that you could track things outside of training as an alternate way to fulfill a use case, like doing a work task and having it tracked and credited to clip out of something. Profiles for various media can help capture the context of a learning experience for the technology application. A mobile learning experience could also reuse a video profile to create more depth to its instrumentation of the user experience. One thing I also want to throw out to the newer folks in the community is about naming. Many profiles have generic titles at this point, like video and audio. And I think that's due to how early we still are with groups coming together to build them and share them. I anticipate in the future, you'll see profiles around very specific things that are versioned more like traditional software applications. So let's start by talking about what a technical rule is and what it isn't. It's guidance in the profile that must be followed in order to say you're using the actual profile. These are things that are measurable, not inferred, so code can be run to check that you're doing it right. Today, if you need to change something in a profile, you have different options to iterate on it, or just publish a new profile. You can even just take what you need and use it internally to your organization. All of these are okay, but I encourage you to participate in the community whenever you can to help share your findings and improve the practice of using profiles. So validation and acquisition mean something very specific. Here it's more about verification, but since this stems from a standard, the words are used a bit differently. We don't have a digital validation process yet, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. To have validity in a profile, you must have valid statements, especially when working with cmi5. You have to track cmi5 defined and cmi5 allowed verbs. From a design perspective, I advise structuring your approach by prioritizing what matters first. Think about the learner. Think about who cares about the data, where's it going, and what needs to be included to make it stand on its own. Recently, Jason Haig published a great article on the 10 best practices for creating XAPI statements on Learning Solutions magazine. I highly recommend looking it up. And finally, as Andy discussed earlier, the semantic web is here and it works. Profiles are just a way to bring it to learning data. Today, people build profiles from the specification and tend to author them with a few assistive tools, like websites that walk through adding the various components of a statement together. That creates a lot of drift in what qualities exist in any given profile beyond just conforming with the specification from a functional perspective. Some profiles come from engineers, some come from artisans, and neither is necessarily better than the other, just different. As you go into creating a profile, it should be seen as a team sport. Having subject matter experts, an ISD, and a programmer involved is usually key to producing a profile that meets the needs of your organization in a timely fashion. Think about what you're measuring and what happens if you have to adjust that measurement in the future. It's easy just to instrument everything on the first step, but down the road, that can create a massive data set that is really hard to update when things change. Just because you can send a statement doesn't mean that you should. Remember to design to the learner experience and who cares about the statements. You have to balance the artisan approach with over-engineering. Otherwise, your data will be usable, but it won't be useful. So there's a lot going on here. So let's add a story to what we're looking at. The soldiers are looking at a dashboard and trying to understand the state of people under their command and who is best prepared for being assigned a task. There's a lot of data that they could look at. In our discussion, we've covered the idea of tying everything together thanks to cmi5. Since our dashboard is built on this idea, the soldiers see a depiction of data that is easy to understand, since they're used to dealing with credentials to estimate readiness. To build out a dashboard like this with multiple data sets being combined isn't trivial. There's a lot of questions that we have to answer. What is the experience? Is it the course or is it the demonstration of some kind of proficiency? Is it both? Is there information that needs to be exposed in the experience to have a valid representation, like details on the media or the environment that the training occurred in? Nesting many data sets defined by profiles under cmi5 really helps to go beyond just maintaining a certification with hours and assessment. It creates a record where you can dive down into what was really happening. So let's assume that they've successfully answered all these questions. The dashboard they're looking at has a top-level view that is easy to understand. A troop has studied an ebook, done some training, and used some simulators to maintain their cert, so they're current. The supervisors can look at what specific tasks were involved in the simulation and see if they have the right prior knowledge and skill to be assigned the task in question. This is what we want to see happening. So I've been looking a lot at cmi5 as a way to transform evidence from other systems into that traditional course outcome format. Some of those systems could be maintenance systems, simulators, or records from military exercise. Imagine all kinds of records populating an LRS today. You would have to build out a range of dashboards and reporting methods to get all that data into a common view to track progression. I see the opportunity to start a cmi5 course, have it on standby with data coming in from many sources. Art's example earlier of having a vendor hosting content somewhere else and providing it as a service is the start of this. I think that structure that it imparts can simplify moving from our current world of tracking all kinds of things in different places into a more unified tracking system tied to learning experience. And finally, this approach of nesting data like specific media, demonstration of proficiency, and completions can simplify configuration management, just like Art was talking about for his example. Often we change out labs and exercises in a course, but we don't change the course identification number structure. By nesting profiles, we can continue this practice, but also have digital traceability. So now that we've dived into using profiles within a CMI5 EU, I think it's important to revisit CMI5 defined versus CMI5 allowed. And remember the things that are on this slide. Profiles are tagged within an XAPI context. This is the same way that it worked, and we've gone through this quite a bit. But when you're nesting profiles, there's an inherited quality that stems from the CMI5 defined to CMI5 allowed relationship. It should be considered in all the work. You want to be aware of duplicating verbs and other XAPI components in your specific use case. If you have a duplication and you don't think through how this will affect your data long-term, it can cause confusion. It's not going to break it, but it may be hard to understand it later. The amount of data you capture is really up to you, but think about what needs to be moved by CMI5 versus things that can be sent to other LRSs or even held at the originating system. You can use XAPI extensions to have traceability down to levels of detail without moving everything. And this can be a bit complicated, but it allows for a lot of that flexibility we've been discussing. So where do you start and where are we all going? So start with the specifications for XAPI and XAPI profiles as you begin this journey. They aren't trivial documents. They expect a reader that has a blend of knowledge in engineering and instructional design. But become familiar with all the concepts, but try to build a team around you. The next thing is this idea of bad data is important. Even a minor typo can create a lot of chaos in a profile. That will promulgate through all the data and can be difficult to fix later. Conformance and quality assurance are very important in the engineering of XAPI profiles and their application. But that level of investment is proportional to how much data you capture. Having profiles that target the right amount of information can help reduce the magnitude of engineering hours on a project. And it really just starts with the data. Your strategy has to sample the right things to draw out valid information from the learner experience. Profiles are a great way for a community to share methods on how to accomplish this. A key tool in the community now is the XAPI vocabulary server hosted by the ADL initiative. It hosts many profiles and has a solid interface for navigating and using them. I use it often in my own work. It's just the start though. Right now, a new capability is being created known as the XAPI profile server and funded by the ADL initiative. I see this server as the way that all the great information in the profiles in the vocab server will transform into knowledge across the community. The server is expected to have the ability to enable the creation and use of profiles at a greater scale than we've seen to date. I believe that the profile server will also answer a question that I've had for a while. What's a good profile? Good isn't the kind of words that engineers use to describe something. Measures of effectiveness tend to be quantified. For a profile, it needs to be so much more than function. As we see more profiles being published to a server in the future, I think that good will be defined by the community. The profile server also represents a key tool for the acquisition community where a lot of my career was spent. It's being built as a service that anyone can use and that will persist. Like the other conformance tools ADL has hosted in the past, it can start acting as a point for everyone to enable the adoption of XAPI in their contracts by definitions published in a public domain. So I encourage you to become a part of the community. The CMI5 working group is a fun way to spend part of your Friday. There's lots of IEEE working groups that exist for a range of efforts. The XAPI vocabulary server is up and running now. It's available. The hyperlinks here on this slide. And remember, usable XAPI statements lead to usable profiles. CMI5 provides a way to make them useful. I hope you enjoyed this, and on to the next learning outcome.
All right, great. Thank you, Mike. So we'll proceed on to expected learning outcome number 4. Now, in this next section, we're going to actually apply the cmi5 design principles and specifically code to a course. Notice that even saying the word course already has some design implications. In addition, while there are 2 varieties of courses that will be discussed, we're actually going to look at 4 different applications to courses. Now, if you don't specifically know SCORM, do not worry. This tutorial doesn't get that technical and doesn't give you either, or your developer, will give you the resources that you need to accomplish the task. You may ask, what is the point of even talking about SCORM? Well, the answer is that you might not have access to an LMS that supports cmi5. cmi5 is relatively new, but you likely do have access to one that supports SCORM. SCORM also has a very logical way of capturing the same events that cmi5 does, which we can leverage in a solution. But first, what is a course? So when we talk about a course, we talk about files that consists of files or at least has links to learning content assets. So we have some raw web-based content in front of us and we can access it, right? Manifest, or a listing of those files or links and their structures. So our supply these as AUs or blocks, because we specifically need to have a way to list them and point to them. Next, we need some sort of code that connects to an LMS or LRS. This is what SCORM and cmi5 are for, but the code itself is likely JavaScript. And there are 4 actions associated with a course. You have to import it, which establishes a link between the course provider and some system. We need to register it, which actually refers to 2 different registrations that are occurring. One, a user registers for a course to gain permission to access it, but a user also has a registration with the system they are using in order to take that course. Next, the actual content is experienced by the user when we talk about the step through, and some web events are tracked through the code. Finally, the last action, there's some sort of completion, and there's probably some sort of assessment along the way. But those 4 actions then make up a bulk of what's going on within a course. Finally, the context of what's going on is that we're running in an authenticated and authorized environment. That's what the LMS does. So to put a bow on it, there are 3 parties, course, system, and learner, and all must have this handshake together. Now, going back to this cmi5 flow, we're going to look at this a little more simply. The top yellow series is all about making sure that the learner is correctly registered. The second row then works back to the left to launch the content, and the pink is where all those programming actions happen before the LMS gets re-involved as we move back into the blue boxes. Now, these processes repeat for each asset in the course, or SCO in the course, or AU, but the flow between the content and the system is the same. It cycles through this, and along the way also looking at the satisfaction of each of these types of events. All right, let's start talking creation of content. The first topic will be starting from content that has no particular tracking standards applied. And even if it does, we're going to ignore those particular standards. You'll see here a checklist of those components and resources which we'll use to get the job done. All these resources can be found in the bibliography of this presentation. We're not going to put code up in front of you as a part of this tutorial, rather just tell you the specific ways to access the templates. So let's talk about what is needed to create this course as well as the process behind it. So first, course files, meaning content pages, can use the AU example template that's in the cmi5 client library. And the manifest for those files, excuse me, the cmi5.xml is also in the client library. Blocks in this case are sold separately. There's no blocks in that particular example, but don't worry, we'll get to you. Now, we're going to look, just to kind of briefly show what that is. Here's the client library view. It's a GitHub page. And all these are resources that are referenced at the end, so you'll have access to all of these if you choose to come back and step through this. Now, for the actual programming, remember that cmi5 has only a few particular events, and those are included in the script folder on this particular page. Now, to capture this import and registration, this is why there's an LMS involved. The fetch URL portion is handled by this content, and the content provided in the templates, and I suggest that you dig into the code to fully understand it if you want to. Otherwise, just know that it's happening. For all the cmi5 events that aren't automatic, you can match your corresponding events to those found in this JS resource. For example, there's a div tag that contains an assessment. So if you wanted to use an assessment, you could essentially send the code in there or make modifications as you see fit. You can also make modifications to complete sub-items or score them. So if you have questions on a test, you want to add them, or if you have nested content that you want to add, or interactions you want to capture, you can do that as well. You just have to make sure you change your statement to reflect the item and not the AU. And by doing that, you also then have to make sure that you are changing for your cmi5 defined to cmi5 allowed. So basically, the world is your oyster when it comes to using the different controls in here. Now, while the code isn't the exact same as in the repository, there are other resources that if you want to do other customized things in cmi5, there are a lot of resources and code examples that you can see. So even if the fragments you aren't looking for aren't specifically in the particular client library, there's a lot of other places to grab them. We walk through many, many scenarios, as I'll show in the resources section, of how you can really cut and paste your way to victory. Now, again, the environment, notice that we do require for this implementation a cmi5 LMS or player. So if you don't have one, then that kind of leaves you with some other options, which in the first one we'll look at is replacing a SCORM course. So again, if we're going to talk about cmi5 replacing SCORM, you may ask, if I'm just replacing SCORM, why not delete everything? Well, if you don't have that cmi5 LMS, but you do have a SCORM LMS and an available LRS, which is kind of another caveat to this, this solution could work for you. Now, we're going to step through, and similar to before, let's walk through how this will work. Now, for SCORM, the files and even the manifest are actually all in the SCORM package itself. Remember, there's no links. There are resources for creating SCORM packages at adlnet.gov if you don't already have them. But part of the premise of this is that you already have SCORM courses that you're going to look to convert and then use cmi5 on. As previously stated, a cmi5 manifest is available for reference if you want, but our manifest is basically covered by the SCORM's IMS manifest.xml, which is a standard part of that package. Now, when it comes down to programming, we've got the XAPI wrapper and scripts that are in the cmi5 client library. As you can, right here, there's a wrapper there that exists that's going to basically modify all the scripts you need for you. So by using that wrapper, you can do all of the programming that you need to do. Now, the import and the registration are both handled by the SCORM LMS, so there's no need to worry about that aspect in this implementation. Now, one thing to note, though, is that the SCORM LMS will not be able to share this information directly with the XAPI LRS. You're going to need a separate configuration to do that. So that's why you would use this configuration here. Now, the biggest black mark about a solution like this is that it isn't overly secure. As you can see here, we're actually embedding a password and a username in a script file. You'd have to use another standard or another way of obscuring, perhaps LTI, which is a standard that's commonly used in LMS, is to obscure these content details and still be interoperable. Now, going back to these web events and completions, the script file is going to replace what's already there in your content, but you can certainly make modifications and additions. And sample statements of all kinds can be found in the cmi5 working group resources. So if there's a particular statement you want to use instead of what's there, you can modify it. Now, you can see that this is just one way to set the LRS configuration. There are others, but again, you'd have to make sure no one can access them. Now, these scripts support multiple versions of SCORM, as you can see here with the SCORM 1.2 and SCORM 2004, but it does introduce requirements to, again, have that LMS and the SCORM content. I'd also like to say that the wrapper isn't a perfect match to cmi5, but you can get there with some slight modifications, because this is actually part of this Experience API, XAPI SCORM profile, not specifically cmi5. But between this and the resources available on the cmi5 working group site, you'll be able to get there. And there's the other little black mark on this solution, and why I prefer the next solution instead, is because it leaves a bit of inconsistency in the use between the LMS and LRS. So if you talk about what's going on, there, again, you have the SCORM LMS that would take you all the way really to the launch part, and at this point, whatever in the pink box is going to be written to the LRS, including those border blue boxes of the initialized and terminated. But really, it's a little bit awkward of a flow because the LRS is brought in for part of it, but the SCORM is relied on for the other part. So you kind of have a little bit of control issues with the handoff, which is why it's much easier to supplement a SCORM course with cmi5 than it is to necessarily replace it. So if we're relying on SCORM infrastructure already, supplementing it just makes more sense than simply replacing it. And while that wrapper can be used successfully to migrate, it also leaves a bit of inconsistency between that LMS LRS communication, as we saw in that previous flow. Now, previously, we've talked about some of the benefits of XAPI, but why on earth would I want to keep both SCORM and XAPI in the same solution, which is really what we're talking about doing? And clearly, inertia is a big reason to do that. XAPI and cmi5 support is an investment. Prototyping XAPI is really a reason that you would want to look at this, because if you haven't quite made the jump to buying that cmi5 LMS, you might want to see what it can do. And prototyping XAPI and cmi5 is a great way to do this. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that SCORM visualizations have been failing for quite some time. Again, you are limited by the innovation of the tool provider when you're using SCORM. You can't really do much of your own. You can't put your own expertise into your own products, unfortunately, in your own services. The notion of data getting out is a big one, as many SCORM LMSs fail to really capture data across learners. It's not part of the standards. A lot of them simply don't do it. And finally, SCORM becomes the more trusted system. You've probably had it for a while. It's probably past your procedures. People have accounts to it. So getting the most out of that solution is going to be better, especially if you can kind of have a best of both worlds. And if you're tracking, because cmi5 and XAPI are going to send data to a completely different system anyways in this solution, it makes sense that if you're doing some sort of prototype activity, especially one that might have anonymized data, that you separate that out. So there's a lot of reasons to put this solution out there, because there's a lot of different use cases for it. Now, you'll notice this slide is exactly the same as the previous, and really the only difference is that we're not going to actually replace the code, we're going to supplement it. And this is going to take a bit more work, but still not too much. Essentially what the goal is here is we want both the previous code and the new code to execute. So there's going to be some splicing you would grab from the SCORM XAPI wrapper, and you would splice the code rather than essentially just replacing it. So anything that you found of value, you would keep. So you would still have a SCORM call, but then you would also introduce an XAPI call. So really, the wrapper is going to again be that key in splicing the code, but what we need to do again is configure the system to, again, you'll have that insecure configuration, but we're hoping that it won't matter as much, because this data doesn't have to be the authoritative source for completions, for example. We can still rely on SCORM to have that authoritative completion, but then the XAPI can be used for visualizations, whether it's on that completion pass-fail data or it's a different prototype capability you're looking to do. And again, it's all very customizable. So getting back to the flow again, it's worth stating here now where the content goes blue, it's now actually tracked by both the LMS and LRS to the degree that the user decides what to track. Now, our last use case is not so much of its own strategy, but something that you've likely realized is going on through the other three solutions, and that would be adding new functionality to the courses through the use of profiles. Because cmi5 and SCORM do relatively the same thing, we get caught up sometimes in the form and implementation more than the functionality. We don't want to lose track that one of the main benefits of cmi5 is to bring XAPI to those that are already implementing courses. The biggest benefit to bringing XAPI is that you can start to track anything that's found in an XAPI profile. You can capture video progress, you can capture detailed interactions. So if you remember, cmi5 defined indicates that cmi5 is used. And in this way, every statement is tagged as belonging to one or more XAPI profiles, because that's what you're actually doing when you're saying cmi5 defined or cmi5 allowed. It's really two different profiles in one. So for adding other profiles, you would use this exact same procedure, except you would need both the cmi5 allowed and whatever profile you are using. And you would simply add that to the context activity for each of those profiles that you want to use. This use of multiple profiles is allowed. Of course, you can do it within a course page or even the same statement. It allows us to track interesting things and to get out of the paradigm of distributed learning courses. Now, moving on to this last section, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but it prepares you to make decisions about cmi5 based on the best available information and resources. So let's jump right into that. Now, I first want to call out the cmi5 working group is really where most of these resources are found and where a lot of this effort has already gone in. So behind every profile is really that unified and hard working group, and that's what this group is. And I think it's just really worth hammering the point here that this group started before XAPI. It then recognized the value of XAPI and changed gears to use that. So back then they were using WSDL and SOAP, which you don't really have to worry about what those are, but they saw XAPI and went in that direction. This group is open, it's friendly, and it's not sponsored by any organization specifically. It uses a conferencing solution from ADL, but really that's it. And we really you should consider joining if you're interested. And we're really serious about the no experience required. We've had plenty of people show up, didn't know what they're doing, and they've contributed for years. And sometimes fresh eyes are just the best possible thing for a group. So we'd welcome you to come on in and join us. Specification documents linked here, but really all the links and articles are going to be in the bibliography at the end of this section. So what I want to talk about next is buying a cmi5 or XAPI product. If you're looking to get into acquisition, here's some tips that we can provide to you. First, do not provide a product that simply claims XAPI conformance. Because XAPI is really, because it's so open, if a tool is telling you what it's implementing, it's not going to be very clear what that is. You won't really know what you're going to get. Now, looking for specifically cmi5 profiles or other named XAPI profiles is the way to go, because those mean very specific things that you can then rely on from your content. In particular, if it's an authoring tool, what you're going to want to do is acquire some sample output. And when you do that, then you can test that with a known and trusted LMS LRS combination, depending what you're looking to test. If it's XAPI or cmi5. If it's cmi5, you will need that LMS. And if it's a system that you're looking at claiming conformance, you would ask them to test it with a sample course. And again, you would need a known and trusted course to do this, but then you could see how it does with that course. Now, this last bullet here is really a big deal, because the government is paying to have these developed, ADL specifically, when I say they're available, available to you for free. The intention here is to not replace, but to encourage tool vendors to create content that can be tested and systems that can expand on the basic functionality after these prototypes model what's going on, to really help drive the marketplace. The conformance test in particular is really good at removing the finger pointing that might happen when something doesn't quite work as intended. And as you can see, this will be available in late 2021. Again, it's all open source, all free. So until we have that particular capability in place, what you're going to want to do is look at the following testing criteria that you can kind of put out there for yourself. And first, the learning record store. If you want to test one of those, and recognize that an LRS is not sufficient for cmi5 conformance. As Art said, there are different statements that aren't going to be sent. I'm sorry, that's the learning management system side. LRS capability is not sufficient for cmi5 conformance. You have to have the other capability found in the LRS. You have to do registration. So the only way to really test a learning record store that's claiming conformance is to test it as an LMS, because you'd have to see which features are missing. So the learning management system side, if you're trying to test if they do claim that they're a learning management system, then you actually want to verify that all 9 types of cmi5 statements work, because between the LMS and content, you're going to have that handoff of both. You're going to want to verify the suspend and resume functionality works. As Art talked about, the state API can capture bookmarking. You're going to want to verify that all roll-up rules work. As Art mentioned, satisfaction of different blocks and AUs. Make sure that if the system is claiming that it can do that, that it does actually do that. And then do the basic eye test. Make sure that the distributed learning content actually works in there, that it's functioning as it should. And wherever possible on these, test with dashboards. So pulling in statements and looking at them for data head might work, but really, if you're going to connect these to a visualization and a dashboard, you're going to want to connect that data right away and see if it's working. And then finally, authoring tools. So remember that an authoring tool's output is really going to be a course, and in cmi5, that's going to include a course structure format. And you're going to be reliant still on that learning record provider to actually create and send the statements. The content, the course, can hand it off successfully, but the learning record provider is going to need to create the statements. Now, in cmi5, the AU really is that. So if it's producing an AU, you're going to see that import, once the LMS takes control of it, it's going to function in a way that's going to send those statements together. So remember that statements heading to a learner record provider should be full. It should have all the information you need, the cmi5 allowed, cmi5 defined. But do remember that not all cmi5 statements are issued by the content. So it's not reasonable to expect statements out of that course that aren't intended to come out of that course. The LMS is still responsible. Now, you're going to also want to make sure that the authoring tool is extensible, because if all it can do is cmi5, you're not going to be happy with it, because then you're still going to be on the hook for expanding into XAPI, and the tool isn't going to necessarily help you get there. You're probably still going to need a programmer to create those types of statements. So I would recommend that the tool that you acquire also has the ability to expand into XAPI. And remember that learning authoring tools output in LMS combinations can eliminate the need for an LRP, but it's not guaranteed. Really, it's about that handshake, and it's about that conformance test. And until that conformance test is in place, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So really make sure you've got both sides of the coin in terms of testing those. That test suite's going to enable the rest of that to be enabled. So getting into just a few of the resources that we've got from the cmi5 working group, sample statements. You can access the samples at this site, and we give statements for 13 different specific cmi5 scenarios, and it goes perfectly with the workflow that we've shown throughout this presentation, and it includes a lot of different sessions. So it gets into what happens if you want to do no credit, what happens if you want to, how you use the mastery score. Art talked about that a lot, but this is the specific code to do that, how you do multiple temps, and then of course exploring the notion of what cmi5 allowed actually does. Again, here we've already used this a lot. This is the client library, so this is a link to that and another screenshot of that. Again, all these are going to be available in the bibliography. Now, next are two of my favorite resources of the cmi5 working group. And first of those is the best practices. And there's a few intricacies of cmi5 that we couldn't really teach you in this session. And this paper highlights highlights some of the tougher areas of cmi5 if you go to that link. And some of these things are how exactly that authentication handoff works, again, mastery score, some lessons learned in mobile, objectives, which are enabled by cmi5 in the core structure format as well, and some of the error handling procedures that exist. And of the two resources that I mentioned, my favorite is the worst practices. So this resource really highlights some of the real mistakes that people, even in the group, have made, and it addresses some of those pitfalls and early mistakes that adopters are going to make. Now, this doesn't include silly things like, oh, I'm just going to use the same activity ID for every activity so it can pass a test. No, this includes really advanced topics, like how you would actually use the different IDs, how you can look at registration, and other different practices that you might fall into if you are new. So please learn from our lessons and our worst practices and move from there. The cmi5 adopters is another resource that's part of the cmi5 working group, and it's important to maintain a list of adopters because what we want in that cmi5 group is adoption. So it encourages these listings, and these are all based on self-reporting. So if your product should be on this list, you should let the cmi5 working group know and probably even join us. On this cmi5 is a list of cmi5 supported tools. This is current as of June 2020 when this slide was made, so I apologize if things have not been added. And then, of course, there's a cmi5 adopter LMSs as well. So I wanted to spend, as we wind down, just a minute to thank the cmi5 working group members, past and present. Special thanks to Bill McDonald, who has chaired this group since the beginning, and Amazon for letting Bill join us every week. And everyone who attended a meeting from May 15th to October 15th of this year is listed. We'd encourage you all to join us. It's that GoToWebinar link that you see down below. And now Mike is going to talk to us a little bit about acquisition, and you can see on the right while he's speaking some of the ways that ADL is supporting that. Mike?
Yeah, thank you. And so, these are major resources that are coming up for the vIITSEC community, and they should be aware of. Standards, as we see cmi5 become one, make for strong contracts. The test suite is going to be something that will allow both government and vendors to know that their products will meet, the requirements that they're trying to go for. And these templates are going to be critical because it provides a baseline for everybody to work from. It's a lot like the resources that Andy was just talking about. I also want to bring up that the player, which will be available in 2021, is a really valuable resource. Having software that can be used very soon will enable our community to experience cmi5 firsthand. So, Andy.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. So let's go over our learning outcomes. Hopefully now you've gained that baseline understanding of XAPI. You understand the subject matter of cmi5. You understand the application use of XAPI profiles. You can understand how to apply cmi5 as a replacement to SCORM or in its own right in a traditional e-learning course. And that you understand the products and services available that integrate cmi5. Now, I just want to spend a couple minutes because I'm not sure if everybody is going to watch the video first or have the presentation slides available first. Just leaving these up just for a couple seconds each so you can grab any of the resources here that are listed in the bibliography, just so you can have time to read them. Maybe take a screenshot if you have a moment. But these resources are all great. The working group has worked hard to put these together to encourage adoption of cmi5. And during the actual live session, you'll be able to ask us questions. We'll be there the whole time. On behalf of our Werkentin and Mike Hernandez, thanks so much for joining our session. Hope that you're well, and we will see you online. Bye, everyone.